Prior to the outbreak of war between the North and South over states' rights to maintain slavery, and prior to emancipation, issued January 1, 1863, the abolition of and protest to the peculiar institution of slavery was the primary concern of a vast majority of African American literatures, whether implicitly or explicitly addressed and presented. This protest against the enforced bondage of 3 million plus Americans of African descent is captured in the oratory of Henry Highland Garnett and Sojourner Truth, the poetry of Phillis Wheatley, the slave narratives of Frederick Douglass, Harriet Jacobs, and Lucy Delaney, and the polemics of W.E.B. Du Bois. But it is the double-voiced protest of the spirituals that best captures the tragicomic underpinnings of African American protests in literature, at least prior to the Civil War and the rise of African American secular music. Existing as a queerly covert technique of voicing one's displeasures with the conditions of slavery while at the same time critiquing and exposing slavery's functions of delimiting the humanity of African Americans, the spirituals reflect the wearing of the mask so integral to not only the production of African American literatures, but the survival of African Americans within the hostile racial landscape that is America. Still, the close of the Civil War engendered the Reconstruction era and the sense of jubilee among newly freed slaves. The feelings of optimism and hope were reflected in the music and in the literature and were embodied in the persona of the new Negro. Determined to throw off the vestiges of slavery, demeaning drudgery, and labor as an impoverished, uneducated peasant, post-Civil War Negroes sought to emulate their white Victorian-era European American middle-class counterparts. In so doing, African Americans protested their overdetermined status within the American public sphere as chattel and barbaric heathens and sought out arenas of transcendence where they could test the limits of possibility as regards their humanity. Testing the possibilities of transcendence was particularly true as regards the development of African American music in the post-Civil War era. The development of ragtime and the blues was, in part, the reflection of African American middle-class aspirations and lower-class determinations to celebrate individuality and to be heard within the public sphere. Moreover, the aesthetics of these late 19th and early 20th century musical genres were utilized by African American literary artists in the development of African American literary modernism, itself the underbelly of American literary modernism, according to Michael North in The Dialect of Modernism. Just the same as the 19th century turned to the 20th century, African American just the same as the 19th century turned to the 20th century, African American emancipationist dreams of the beneficial influences of the consequences of the Civil War and Reconstruction as regards solidifying and safeguarding the civil liberties of African Americans were quickly dashed. First, by the Tilden-Hayes Compromise of 1877, and second, by the Plessy v. Ferguson case of 1896. Both worked to delimit and to constrict the civil liberties of African Americans, and in many respects to recatalyze them. Nevertheless, the trope of the new Negro would continue to reflect the ethos of post-Civil War African Americans after 1896 and would become the dominant theme associated with literatures of the Harlem Renaissance. This unit highlights Reconstruction and its influence on the development of ragtime and the blues, secular music as protest, secular music as acculturation, the ragtime literary aesthetic, the blues literary aesthetic, the new Negro in African American literature. In 1866, barely a year after the end of the Civil War, Frederick Douglass wrote an article in the Atlantic Monthly directed to the United States Congress. The article warned that if the state governments of the rebellious Confederate States were not reconstructed, then the freed slaves would be in danger of recatalyzation in America. By 1866, Reconstruction efforts had been going on for almost 3 years. Douglass's fears of the return of Redeemer governments of the South would be alleviated for another 11 years, until the Tilden-Hayes Compromise of 1877. Among African Americans of the time, the Compromise of 1877 was referred to as the Great Betrayal and resulted in the loss of political power for most Southern Black Republicans. Moreover, African Americans in general were subject to discrimination and harassment, and efforts to suppress their exercise of the voting franchise increased. By 1905, most Black men were effectively disenfranchised by state legislatures in every Southern state. It is no coincidence that the Fisk Jubilee singers ceased touring in 1878. While Burton Peretti suggests, in the chapter entitled Jubilee in Tin Pan Alley from Lift Every Voice and Sing, The History of African American Music, that the Fisk Ensemble made tours of North America and Europe and continued to raise money for Fisk University until 1878, when the exhausted George White and Ella Shepard suspended most of its operations, one has to imagine that the injuries and insults suffered as a result of white prejudice, violence, and segregation played significant roles in the exhaustion suffered by White, Shepard, and the singers. Pauline Hopkins plays on these themes of white prejudice, violence, and segregation as regards the construction and representation of her character, Diantha Lusk, in the novel Of One Blood. Hopkins uses the representation of Diantha to illustrate the depths of suffering that African American women experience in the post-Reconstruction era as a result of being doubly veiled in African American society. Hopkins uses the representation of Diantha to illustrate the depths of suffering that African American women experience in the post-Reconstruction era as a result of being doubly veiled in American society. In a passage referring to the veil, Diantha says to the male character Ruel, "Give me the benefit of your powerful will. I know much, but as yet have not the power to express it. I see clearly, much dimly, of the powers and influences behind the veil, and yet I cannot name them. Sometime the power will be mine, and mine shall be." To put the passage in proper context, one must understand that Diantha is experiencing an otherworldly trance in the presence of white male medical professionals. She has tapped into a power that none of the white men can comprehend. As the narrator states previous to the passage, none of the men recognized her. Men do not recognize Diantha on 2 levels. 1. Men like Ruel, who attend a performance of the Fisk Jubilee singing group of which Diantha is a part, fail to recognize Diantha as a Black woman. And 2, the medical professionals do not recognize Diantha's skills as a practitioner of one of the many new psychologies. By placing Diantha at the center of new psychological and spiritual professionals, Hopkins makes an entry point in the field of the new psychological and spiritualist culture to reclaim and reimagine how Black women specifically might re-inhabit and renegotiate the political and social utility of the movement surrounding what William James labeled the unclassified residuum around the turn of the 20th century. In the passage, Diantha speaks in a trance, perhaps channeling Mira, an absent, veiled African American woman, and her mother. One gets a fuller understanding of living behind the veil as an African American woman. She sees much clearly, and she sees much dimly. This sensory confusion is a result of living behind the veil and its affecting of double, even triple consciousness, living as two, even three, American and African American and female in one. She feels the power of this second, even third sight, but cannot quite codify its meaning, purpose, or function. One day she, as a woman, will understand her power, and she will share that power with Ruel, if he and his powerful will, buttressed by strength and courage, are receptive. In this manner, Hopkins asserts the development of a healthy African American conception of masculinity. For their parts, African American men may want to consider that which may be of value and found within African American feminist conceptions of what it means to be a human being, as presented by Hopkins in the character of Diantha. One other thing worth noting. This is the only instance in the entire novel when Hopkins refers to Du Bois's theory as the veil with a capital V. It is the only time that the concept is recorded as a proper noun. By utilizing the proper noun, Hopkins informs her audience in no uncertain terms that the selected passage represents her understanding of how the veil metaphor most accurately functions in American society. The most effective understanding of the veil includes issues of both race and gender. Black women are not the only women in society to suffer misrecognition as a result of being veiled in the novel. Molly Vance, Hopkins's representation of a wealthy white female, too suffers misrecognition. And from Ruel no less, underscoring the veil through which Ruel sees the world as a Black man and the veiled position of Molly as a woman in American society. During a holiday gathering, which also serves to function as a celebration of Molly Vance's engagement to Aubrey Livingston, Ruel's veiled vision of Molly is described by the narrator. As Ruel studies Molly Vance, a dark veil settled like a pall over the laughing face. Now, there are two interpretations that Hopkins could be trying to solicit from her audience based on her representation of the interaction between Ruel and Molly. As regards the first interpretation, Ruel could be represented as seeing Molly's future death. He could clearly see the dark veil settling over her like the pall over a coffin. In his role as a mesmerist and hoodooing folk healer, he sees Molly's future and anticipates her death. This is a positive representation of Ruel's mesmerist abilities. The scene works to validate his powers. Acknowledging another perspective, Ruel could be represented as a man who misrecognizes Molly at the instant she is joyfully discussing her future marriage to Aubrey. He does not see Molly clearly, just as most women are not seen clearly by men. In the passage, Hopkins underscores the veiled nature of both Black and white women in American patriarchal society. Even more, in so doing, Hopkins makes an argument for the idea that wherever there is patriarchal rule, women exist in subjugated, veiled positions. The last passage that references the veil in Of One Blood, with relevance to the historically veiled nature of women in America, occurs after Diantha learns that Aubrey has deceived her regarding the circumstances leading to their union. The narrator gives voice to Diantha's internal critique of herself as she becomes frantic after learning of Aubrey's treachery. She, a bigamist, another's wife, made so by fraud and deceit, stolen by false tales, forced to live a polluted existence. Her thought took shape, and by her side stood again the form of the pale, lovely mulatress, her long black curls enveloping her like a veil. After learning of Aubrey's deceit, Diantha realizes that she too suffers the veiled position of past women within an American patriarchal society. Like her mother, the mulatress, she has been forced by the acquiescence of society to participate in an unseemly bigamist affair. She too has been stolen, and a man has polluted her innocence. She empathizes with and understands the plight shared with the veiled woman who appears to her as visions. And all the veiled women in the past histories of African Americans who have suffered sexual indignities, insults, and rapes, beginning with the Middle Passage. The passage underscores feminist perspectives of being veiled and black within a white, racist, patriarchal society. Through no fault of their own, both Diantha and Mira are subjected to the dictates and demands of powerful men within a patriarchal setting over which the women have little power to control, or rather have yet to understand how to yield the powers behind such a veil. In Of One Blood, Pauline Hopkins highlights the degrees to which well-intentioned men like Du Bois appropriate uses of the feminine site of the veil for purposes that generally explains what it means to be African American in 20th century America, yet fail to go further and address the relationship of the veil to women in general and African American women in particular. She reclaims this site for an African American feminist agenda in the furtherance of explaining what it means to be an African American woman at the dawn of the 20th century. While not discounting the relevance of the veil in explaining the plight of African American men in America, Hopkins goes further in her use of the veil to illustrate the doubly veiled position of African American women in America at the intersection of gender and race. Lastly, she seems to indicate that the adoption of some traits of European American middle class patriarchal masculinity is dangerous for the African American, particularly as regards the masculinist traits of revenge, courage, and strength. Applied without great reflection of the consequences of their employment, utilizing some traits of European American middle class patriarchal masculinity can lead to the destruction of African American men adhering to such criteria, and innocent women trapped in the path of such men. As Peretti relates, and Hopkins fictively represents in Of One Blood, discrimination and prejudice met Jubilee singers like Diantha Lusk in the North. The situation in the South after the Civil War and prior to 1900, particularly the time from 1877 to 1895, could not have been much better, especially after the removal of the federal troops and the destruction of Reconstruction. For example, in 1895, hundreds of African Americans were lynched. One would bet that many of these victims were targeted for attempting to live out the hope, optimism, and jubilee associated with emancipation and Reconstruction. The year 1895 would not be the last instance of an alarming blooming of strange fruit in America. The lynching of African Americans as consequence of attempting to exercise their Americanness is a spectacularly terrible secret in America, and one of her most open secrets. Jacqueline Goolsby covers Jacqueline Goldsby covers this terrain in Spectacular Secret: Lynching in African American Life and Literature. After all, Jubilee Hall at Fisk University was built from proceeds from concerts of the Fisk Jubilee singers to protect students and teachers from attacks by the Ku Klux Klan. Nevertheless, with the outbreak of the Civil War, America witnessed the migration of scores of African Americans from Memphis to the Potomac, along with their premier music and literary culture, the spiritual, as slaves stole themselves away from their masters and set up contraband camps among the invading Union soldiers. These camps would reverberate with African American sacred and secular music from all over the South. Even before the end of the Reconstruction and an increase in the surveillance of black bodies accompanied with the restriction of personal liberties and physical liberties, the Fisk Jubilee singers eliminated despair and protest from the original Negro spirituals. In the attempt to marry spirituals with the structure, aesthetics, and expectations of classical European approaches to musicality, the ensemble seemingly stripped the spirituals of the emotional content reflective of their tragicomic origins and aligned with the unknowing ambiguity of the unclassified residuum. Also, as minstrelsy would prove, mainstream Americans desirous of being entertained were not, and still are not, very interested in themes focused upon African American racial uplift, despair, and protest. But the sterile, emotionless, most but the sterile, emotionless, more standardized approaches to constructing and to singing the spirituals may also have been a result of Northern missionaries and the like who helped to found schools like Fisk. The influence of white Northern religious practices began to alter traditional practices as regards singing and constructing the spirituals within the African American church. Du Bois outlines the foundations of the traditional African American church in Souls. In Souls, Du Bois insists that the soul of America, its wild, sweet melodies, its simple faith and reverence, is most of all the gift of black folks. In bestowing this honorific upon African Americans as regards spirituality, Du Bois shares commonalities with Antonin Dvorak's assertion as regards the significance of African American music when he suggested that the future of this country must be founded upon what are called Negro melodies. This gift, this American soul as reflected in the music, is born from the religion of the Negro slave in America based on aspects of nature worship and a belief in the invisible surrounding influences, a mingling of heathen rites and Christianity, alternatively referred to as voodooism or hoodooism. It is this unexplainable mixture that cannot be reduced that reflects what James refers to as the unclassified residuum. According to Du Bois, Negro spiritual adherents have a mystic temperament. Du Bois describes them as being of that deep emotional nature which turns instinctively towards the supernatural. These religion adherents were led by the witch woman and the voodoo priest, who became the center of Negro group life. At the time of the publication of Souls in 1903, Du Bois understood three things that characterized this religion of the slave: the preacher, the music, and the frenzy. Du Bois writes, The preacher is the most unique personality developed by the Negro on American soil. A leader, a politician, an orator, a boss, an intriguer, an idealist. All these he is, and ever, too, the center of a group of men. The preacher is a man of certain adroitness, deep-seated earnestness, and of consummate ability. We find some of these characteristics in the representations of some of the men found in Hopkins's novels, like Dr. Abraham Peters in Contending Forces and Ruel Briggs in Of One Blood. We also find such characteristics in the representations of Madame Frances and Old Aunt Hannah, suggesting an expansion of the gendered role of preachers in African American religion as outlined by Du Bois. Dr. Abraham Peters of Contending Forces is described in no uncertain terms as a who-doing, magnifying doctor. Who-doing and magnifying reflect a supernatural manner of spirits and religion for former slaves like Peters. Dr. Peters seemingly functions as a repository of African American anthropological value. He functions as a record of African American religious experience. According to Peters, since emancipation, all old-time doings of hoodoo is done away. But, as evidenced by his use of the evil eye and ability to pray a person right out the grave by the power of his hands, Peters remembers the old-time ways. For Hopkins, Dr. Peters contains in his representation the remnants of antebellum Black folk culture, reflecting many of the characteristics of African American religion and the African American preacher described by Du Bois. A man of brain and thought, but of unique expression and filled with quaint humor, a well-read man, greatly interested in scientific research, Dr. Peters advertised himself as a magnetic physician. Instinctively understanding the similarities between hoodooing, magnifying, and a number of grand diversions to Christian science, such as hypnotism and pessimism, Peters adopted magnifying as a profession. As a result, and as outlined by Du Bois as regarding the voodoo priest, Peters became a center of Negro group life, bossing a big job, and functioning as a patriarchal community matchmaker, imploring young women to get ginned to any man for better or worser. The representation of Ruel Briggs, Hopkins's protagonist hero in Of One Blood, is illustrative of the recovery of lost powers associated with antebellum African American religion. Born at a different time and place when compared with Dr. Peters, Ruel seems ignorant as regards African religion, that is, hoodoo. Yet, Hopkins describes him as a student of what might be termed absurdities of supernatural phenomena or mysticism, best known to the everyday world as effects of the imagination. Ruel has experience with magnetism. He has the supernatural ability to control the flow of magnetic fluid within the body and bring the dead back to life. Just the same, not one of Ruel's white peers holds the key to unlock Diantha's seeming sleep of death. Ruel's prowess as a magnetic physician not only leads him to become the leader within a specific field of medicine, but of a whole nation of people, Ethiopia, aka the children of Ham, aka African Americans. While not every male character depicted in Hopkins's novels could be considered a preacher, The men that Hopkins considers worthy of leadership within the African American community share many traits with the African American preacher as outlined by Du Bois. All reflect aspects of characterization associated with the Du Boisian explication of the African American preacher. Funny thing, Du Bois's conception of the African American preacher, his idea of the preacher is very phallocentric and masculinist. When he describes the African American preacher, Du Bois writes of men. Through the depictions of Madame Frances in Contending Forces and O Aunt Hannah and Of One Blood, Hopkins makes an argument for the expansion of gender categories as regards who is fodder for African American leadership. The character Madame Frances represents a connection with antebellum African American religion and leadership that is most explicit. Such an explicit, direct connection with antebellum African American religion and conceptions of leadership as exemplified by the characteristics of the preacher piques this reader's mind to question why Hopkins chose a female character to represent such a direct, explicit connection with the antebellum African American past. Why did Hopkins not choose one of her male characters? Hopkins's characterization of Madame Frances makes a political statement as regards a woman's place within structures of African American religion and leadership at the turn of the 20th century. Madame Frances, cut from the purest ebony, is depicted as skilled in the occult arts, once the glory of the freshly imported African, with the ability to foretell the future. Hopkins characterizes the female character as the embodiment of the Negro's heritage. Madame Frances possesses wonderful powers of necromancy, capable of casting spells and charms upon unpleasant neighbors. She is a spiritualistic soothsayer and marvelous mind reader. It is Madame Frances who receives the most direct treatment of what Hopkins calls the one great racial characteristic of the Negro and what Du Bois calls a most vital part of the history of the Negro in America: antebellum African American religion, the arts of the voodoo doctor. Not only does Madame Frances embody the real heart of the Negro, the great racial characteristic of the Negro, but Madame Frances embodies a great many of the characteristics outlined by Du Bois as relates great African American male preachers. She represents a leader, a politician, an orator, a boss, an intriguer, an idealist, and the center of a group of men. She is a leader of great value to those who need her services. She is a politician. She has no problem leveraging her skills and abilities to attract philanthropic interest in the welfare of the colored people. She is an orator. She spins narratives of the lives of people. She is a business unto herself, self-employed, for some of the richest people in the city visit to test the ability of the woman. She is her own boss. She is the intriguer of the novel. She is responsible for telling tales that foreshadow the fate of the major characters, protagonists and antagonists alike. Yet, she is more than the preacher Du Bois describes. She is female, a woman. While it is Ruel Briggs who represents the future of a Pan-African conception of male leadership, it is O Aunt Hannah who represents the embodiment of the antebellum African American and African American history on American soul in Of One Blood. Without the knowledge of the most noted voodoo doctor or witch in the country, neither the reader nor Diantha nor Ruel would be provided the knowledge to fully understand who the characters really are, their hidden selves, and from whom they descend. Old Aunt Hannah is the linchpin to understanding the history and purpose of the main African American characters in the novel. To know thy hidden self, one must receive knowledge from Old Aunt Hannah, the Voodoo Witch. At the heart of African American identity is an old woman who lives in a one-roomed cabin. Hopkins makes a claim for the acknowledgement of the importance of women and feminism in understanding the hidden identity of African Americans at the turn of the 20th century. The divide within the African American church between traditionalists like Old Aunt Hannah and emancipationists like Ruel as regards approaches to music, the frenzy, and the practice of African American spiritual and religious performance also influenced approaches to and understandings of protest. For example, as early as 1867, a divide developed between those who wanted to worship and sing, emulating the more sterile styles of white Northern benefactors, centered on European American middle class patriarchal conceptions of masculinity, and those who desired to hold on to more traditional African American approaches to worshiping and singing, centered on ways of being engendered by the realities of living in bondage as an American Negro slave. After 1867, more traditional approaches to the spiritual had fallen out of favor. The more conservative masculinist voices within the African American church won out. Still, whether one followed the traditionalist path or the conservative path of the emancipationists, after the fall of Reconstruction, the Black social gospel dominated within the African American church. The Black social gospel is a movement that arose during the trauma and abandonment of Reconstruction, resuming the struggle for Black freedom in America. The movement focuses on the attainment of social justice on behalf of African Americans and refashions the demands of antebellum abolitionism for contemporary postbellum concerns. Historically, the movement sought to engender a sense of modern social consciousness among the African American masses and to destroy the influence and existence of racial caste in America. Moreover, the Black social gospel provided the intellectual underpinnings of the civil rights movement as best evinced by the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education case. In the wake of efforts to subordinate and recatalyze Black bodies in the postbellum era, exemplified by the Compromise of 1877, Black social gospelers not only envisioned what a new abolition should be, but what role African American churches should play in developing the new abolitionism. While there exists a plethora of African American thought leaders whose ideas have infused and directed the Black social gospel, W.E.B. Du Bois remains the dominant figure associated with the movement. Martin Luther King, Booker T. Washington, Frederick Douglass, Alexander Crummell, Malcolm X, and Bobby Seale are also recognized as Black social gospelers. While the Black social gospel dominates within the African American church, its adherents' relationships to religion, spirituality, and service are often ambivalent. For example, both Washington and Du Bois had ambiguous relationships to the church. Nevertheless, in the Reconstruction era, the Black social gospel was pioneered in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the AMEs, and belonged to a protest tradition within African American thought against the presumed ownership of America and American by white citizens of the United States. That is, the Black social gospel confronts and contests who is recognized as an American citizen, and the criteria by which such judgment is made. The target of Black social gospelers is white supremacy, a structure of power based on privilege that presumes to define what is normal according to conceptions of whiteness and the exclusion of Blackness. In short, the crucial thing in combating white supremacy was to build strong Black institutions through which religious commitment effected social change. Black social gospelers focused on social justice, responded to the racial oppression of African Americans, conceived of the United States federal government as an indispensable guarantor of constitutional rights, struggled to address industrialization and economic injustice, grappled with African American disparities as relates to Great Migration, and affirmed the dignity, sacred personhood, creativity, and moral agency of African Americans. The movement calls upon America to fulfill the Declaration of Independence and the Reconstruction Amendments, that is, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and submission to the universal laws, and espouses an economically pragmatic ethos equating capitalism with freedom and self-determination. Black conservative masculinist leadership styles have dominated within the Black social gospeler movement. Black conservatives emphasize the importance of respectability and proper deportment, middle-class morality, Christianity, or a firm religious foundation, and deference to authority. An emphasis on the development of men and masculinist leadership according to middle-class patriarchal criteria is intense within Black conservative thought. While Black conservatism transcends the usual divisions of integrationists and nationalists, of accommodationists and radicals, of traditionalists and emancipationists, and of Bookerites and Du Boisians, any definition of the term is tenuous at best. As Peter Eisenstadt acknowledges, any attempt to define Black conservatism would be delimiting, because no definition would be true of all Black conservatives, and many definitions of Black conservatism will be true of many individuals who are not Black conservatives. Still, most Black conservatives display admiration and respect for America and Western culture and civilization, advocate Black self-determination, oppose white racism, believe in individual achievement, and are negatively critical of those who agitate past grievances and solicit the government for redress of past wrongs. As Michael Oakeshott explains in On Human Conduct, the approach of Black conservatives is to use and enjoy what is available rather than wish for or look to for something else. Black conservatives' faith in America's ability to live up to the ideals of the Declaration of Independence has been characterized as unshakable. For example, while many believe racism tarnishes what America has been and can be, there are still those who hold out the hope that what is valuable in America can and will be separated from its terrible legacy. Just the same, Black conservative masculinist leadership styles can be a bit overbearing for those who fall under their yoke. For example, in the novel Erasure, Percival Everett explores Monk Ellison's attempts to break free from and silence the psychological bondage he experiences as regards his father's overbearing, romanticized, Black conservative social gospeler shadow. As Black social gospeler conservative masculine leadership styles continued to dominate the African American church in the post-Reconstruction era, the traditional spiritual began to fall out of favor. Both thematically and musically, the spiritual had begun to lose the attention to individuality and emotional impact that drew many African Americans to the genre as a method of self expression. Combined with the passage of Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, which literally delimited the physical movements of African Americans at the close of the 19th century, continued Black conservative approaches to the spirituals encouraged African Americans to protest their constricted musical, political, and social statuses through the only means available to them: constant acts of becoming. Musically, such acts of becoming would engender the genres of ragtime and the blues. Politically and socially, the new Negro would begin to pursue her rights within and without African America in ways never before asserted. After the close of the Civil War, particularly by the close of Reconstruction, the minstrelsy show became extremely popular in the South. As the original traditional structures and performances of the spirituals became more and more diluted by classical European approaches to the spirituals, as evinced by the Fisk Jubilee singers, and denigrated and by denigrated crude adaptations and appropriations, as evinced by the blackface minstrel tradition, African Americans sought artistic vehicles that not only allowed truer expressions of who they were as Americans, but provided the emotional and psychological reinforcement needed to continue on with human dignity within the racialized landscape of America. The advent of ragtime and the blues provided such vehicles. Peretti asserts, ragtime and the blues became prominent and even revolutionary musical genres in African American music. Evidence indicates that both styles were shaped by old musical traditions of the African diaspora and were directly inspired by musical practices of poor Southern African Americans after 1865. Beginning around 1900, ragtime became the big new musical rage, bringing fame and influence to musicians such as Scott Joplin and James Reese Europe. Ragtime accompanied a cultural shift in America from the relatively rigid behavioral and morality dictated by the Victorian middle class towards more relaxed social relations, and in some circles and in some white circles towards a new respect for African Americans and their music. By 1910, the blues, not ragtime, was probably the secular music of choice of African Americans in the rural South, but it had a slower path to acceptance among the white mainstream and the urban Black middle class. The blues reflect an expression of authentic African American emotions and tribulations. Ragtime, that genre of music so popularized by the African American musician Scott Joplin, there is a museum dedicated to him right here in St. Louis, gained acclaim around the turn of the century. The music is said to have been created primarily for piano players in saloons, but can also be played on stringed instruments like the banjo. Its application to the piano was pivotal in the development of the genre. Many African Americans, in the pursuit of middle class status, sought to have a piano in their homes at the close of the 19th century. As conservative approaches to the spirituals drove some sacred music players to seek out other avenues of expression, the rag's association with the piano offered such an avenue. Ragtime is derived from African American folk music, banjo music. The fiddle makes me think of the significance and mystical sing of Fiddler and Alex Haley's Roots, and cakewalks. It is, it is most often composed in a 2/4 musical time signature, but not always. Playing ragtime music takes some skill. The main melody of the piece consists of syncopations, while the secondary melody, or bass, consists of regularly accented melody. This might be less of a problem for orchestral players, but is a problem for pianists, since two completely types of melodies have to be played at the same time. Ragtime, in essence, turns the piano into a percussion instrument, sharing similarities with the drum. As an aesthetic for African American poetics, ragtime music serves as a very useful metaphor. Its inherent two-ness, the two melodic frequencies becoming simultaneously, could very much be considered useful in expressing the two-ness of double consciousness. Its two-ness could also represent the duality of the entire American citizenry in general, a mass of humanity of all diverse shapes and colors adhering to one political organizational scheme as found in the Constitution of the United States. The list of two-ness represented by ragtime music goes on and on. The bass melody of ragtime keeps the time, as it is the part consisting of regularly accented melody, accenting the downbeat in a two-beat measure or bar, for example. The main melody is schizophrenic, consisting of wild syncopations, rhythms which are in some way unexpected that make an offbeat tune. Because the bass of the drum has been historically linked to the African, I would argue that the bass part of ragtime represents the African American's racial and cultural contributions to the poetic aesthetic, his Africanness. The main, his Americanness, with its offbeat tunes and rhythms of life appearing seemingly from nowhere. Ragtime is almost utopian in nature. For some African American literary artists, like Paul Laurence Dunbar, poetry captures the ragtime of life. Ragtime, as a theoretical position, dominates the landscape of his novel Sport of the Gods. In Sport of the Gods, a scene occurs in which the character Skaggs says, "Dancing is the poetry of motion." And the character allegorically named Sadness replies, "And ragtime is the dialect poetry." In the passage in which this exchange occurs, Dunbar alerts the reader to his ragtime poetic aesthetic. That ragtime music holds a special interest in Dunbar's creative machinery is unchallenged. References to ragtime dominate scenes in Sport of the Gods, and Dunbar writes the poem, "The Colored Band," playing Sosa in ragtime, in the volume of poetry When Melindy Sings. Dunbar, along with Will Marion Cook, even wrote a characteristically Negro musical comedy entitled Clorinda, the Origin of the Cakewalk, which introduced a New York audience to ragtime music on the stage of Casino Theater in 1898. It is clear that ragtime music is used as an organizational scheme or constructed landscape by Dunbar. He organizes the universe of Sport of the Gods through the lens of ragtime. Returning to the scene with which we began, in the novel, Skaggs says, "I will tell you, Sadness, dancing is the poetry of motion." Sadness replies, "Yes, and dancing in ragtime is the dialect poetry." The above exchange takes place between Mr. Skaggs, an Irish-American reporter for Universe magazine, and Sadness, an African-American member of the great hulking, fashionably uniformed fraternity of indolence that congregates at the Banner Club in New York City on an almost daily basis. It is no unusual affair for white men like Mr. Skaggs, or Skaggsies to his friends, black and white alike, to socialize with blacks at a club like the Banner Club in turn of the century America in a cosmopolitan city like New York. Old Mr. Skaggs is an example of that Northeastern white male who views black culture as a wealth of material to be sensationalized amongst a gazing white public. While a lot of fellas, presumably his white friends, ask Skaggs why he visits that nigger club, Skaggs responds quite honestly. At that nigger club, as you choose to call it, I get more inspiration than I could get at any of the greater clubs in New York. Skaggs has created a self delusional image of himself as naturally inclined to like colored people. While the truth about the young reporter was that he was born and reared on a Vermont farm where his early life was passed in fighting for his very subsistence, the Skaggsy projected at the Banner Club and at the offices of Universe as well is an image of the son of a father who had a big plantation and owned lots of slaves, and as an adult man who played with little darkies ever since he could remember. Skaggsy claims an intimacy with African American history and culture that possibly only exists when he appropriates, like the minstrel show, the landscape of African American history and culture as distilled through his visits to the Banner Club. While secular music in the guise of ragtime replaced the sacred music of the spirituals as the premier African American music genre, ragtime would suffer the same fate as the spiritual, particularly as relates the minstrelsy show. Just as white Americans, in part, enjoyed blackening their faces on the minstrel stage in the effort to confront overdetermined aspects of Victorian European American whiteness beginning in the middle of the 19th century, at the turn of the 20th century, white Americans would gravitate towards ragtime in the efforts to rebel against Victorian morality and social codes, transforming once again African American music into the repository of that which falls outside the bounds of normative whiteness and therefore normative Americanness. Consider how the coon songs appropriate the ragtime aesthetic in works like Max Hoffman's All Coons Look Alike to Me. As ragtime rose and fell in popularity, many other new styles of non religious music were brewing in Black America, particularly in the South. Still, testimony from the early 20th century often notes that the music heard in churches and in juke joints were indispensable. Still, testimony from the early 20th century often notes that the music heard in churches and in juke joints were indistinguishable. For example, the relationship of early blues to the African American church was complex. Churchgoers could never entirely escape the troubles and tensions of the secular black world that the blues described: poverty, discrimination, personal demons, and interpersonal conflict. At the same time, the blues were influenced by religious songs and the spirituals. Despite the different musical qualities of the blues and the spirituals, the blues almost certainly derived their shouting and moaning qualities and bended notes in part from Black sacred song. The blues became the most important of the new secular music styles. In the decades after 1900, the blues became a powerful new statement of the blues became the most important of the new secular musical styles. In the decades after 1900, the blues became a powerful new statement of the mentality of Southern African Americans, new Negroes living under Jim Crow, particularly after Plessy. Blues songs were documents of Black life and thought that fused traditional musical materials and the forms and themes of recent commercial songs. The blues' emotional power and close ties to Black spoken culture ensured that after 1920, it would be far more influential than ragtime in stimulating the grassroots musical creativity of future generations of African Americans, at least according to Peretti. The blues is usually defined as a song style sung by an individual with instrumental accompaniment, typically a guitar played by the singer. Blues song stanzas varied considerably, but the most characteristic form was the three-line stanza, in which each line took up four musical bars, and the second line repeated the first, the AAB form. The three lines of this stanza are colored harmonically by chords rooted in the first, fourth, and fifth notes of the song's scale, respectively, the so-called 1-4-5 chord pattern. Peretti writes, this structure often made the blues sound pentatonic, suggesting its deep roots in the African American musical tradition. To white Americans, the most pungent characteristic of these tunes was their blue notes, which sounded to them like flattened tones, especially the second and sixth notes in a Western style scale. The rhythm of the blues was stable. The rhythm of the blues was stable, usually slow, and featured subtle distortions of tempo and displaced beats that contrasted strongly with the mechanical syncopation of ragtime. The singer's inventiveness was a hallmark of the blues. The use of regular stanzas indicates that blues songs were structured on popular songs, and well-known lyrics from those songs appear in some blues. According to Peretti, the influence of commercial music stops there. In a standard blues song, no two stanzas typically were played or sung the same. Rather, variations in pitch, rhythm, and inflection were highlighted. Unlike commercial minstrel or ragtime singers, blues singers utilized many effects, such as sliding between notes, moaning, growling, and shouting, which helped to proclaim their individuality. Like pentatonic harmony, these effects suggested the blues' closeness to vocal tradition stretching back to Africa. Blues lyrics encompassed a range of subjects that distinguished them sharply from the typical topics of earlier Black-influenced popular songs. They are almost exclusively subjective, telling of the singer's perceptions of the world. Songs told of relationships, most often between the singer and a member of the opposite sex, and of sorrows and delights relating to work, misfortune, or broader social conditions. Some lyrics told their tales in a straightforward manner, while others were rich in metaphors and symbols. Variations of all kinds can be found in the blues of various artists and regions, but all traditions basically resembled this template. Female blues singers were among the leading attractions of the genre, at least early on. Peretti writes, preeminent among the blues women was Gertrude Ma Rainey. Born in Alabama and raised in Columbus, Georgia, Rainey was a veteran of minstrel shows. In 1902, at the age of 20, Rainey apparently heard her first blues song performed by a youth in Memphis. With her husband, William Paul Rainey, Gertrude developed a specialty act in the Rabbit Foot Minstrels called the Assassinators of the Blues, which popularized the term in the early years of the blues. In the 1910s, Rainey became one of the most famous and talked about African American performers due to her talent, activism, and prolific sexual activity. Rainey's booming alto voice easily filled large halls, and she battled for fair pay and better treatment for black performers. In the process, Rainey, along with her protege Bessie Smith and other female singers, developed quite a blues style. Interpreting lyrics that proclaimed female woe and resolve in the battle of the sexes, Rainey, Smith, and others made the blues into an expression of black women's concerns. Women like Ma Rainey and Bessie Smith reflected the ethos of the new Negro. After the fall of Reconstruction, blacks needed to regain a public voice, louder and more strident than it had been even during slavery. The blues and the blues aesthetic provided such vehicles. During our section on the Harlem Renaissance, we will take a look at how literary artists like Langston Hughes used the blues literary aesthetic for literary generative purposes as regards protests to black conservative approaches to African American literary aesthetics and what it means to be black in America during the first quarter of the 20th century.